Berlin, 1945. Rain hissed on smoldering ruins. The city was dying, its bones collapsing under the thunder of Soviet guns. But beneath the chaos another war raged. One fought in silence, between men without uniforms, for secrets worth more than armies. In the heart of the Reich's crumbling empire, a vault door creaked open. Inside, blueprints covered a table, engines that could cross oceans in minutes, bombs that could flatten cities with a single tremor, weapons decades ahead of their time. A gloved hand reached out, brushing away ash. The documents were stamped Reichsministerium für Bewaffnung und Munition. Next to them lay a pistol, still warm. A German officer, dead by his own hand, slumped across the table, his last act to protect what he couldn't destroy. Outside, a British commando team, soaked, exhausted, faces blackened with soot, prepared to move. They were the men of 30 Assault Unit, Ian Fleming's secret raiders, and in their packs they now carried the blueprints that would rewrite the next 50 years of human warfare. No headlines would ever name them. No medals would ever honor them. But when Allied officers saw what these men had stolen, they went silent, utterly, completely silent. It began not with soldiers, but with a writer. In the winter of 1939, when London's nights were split by sirens and orange tracer fire, a young naval intelligence officer named Ian Fleming sat behind his desk at the Admiralty. Cigarette smoke coiled through the air, mixing with the crackle of typewriters and the scent of wet raincoats. He was restless, bored, watching a war being fought in reports, not in blood. Fleming had a theory there that wars weren't only won on battlefields, but in locked rooms, behind steel doors, inside filing cabinets filled with secrets. If we can get to those papers first, he told his commanding officer, we win before they know we're coming. The man across the desk, Admiral John Godfrey, listened in silence. Then he said quietly, then build me a unit that can steal the enemy's mind. And so, under the gray fog of 1942, a small group of men began training in a place no one spoke about, a walled compound on the coast of Scotland known only as Station Duthede. Their names would never appear in army registries. They weren't frontline heroes or parade ground soldiers. They were linguists, thieves, engineers, and safecrackers. Their task, to move behind the front, strike within enemy strongholds, and seize every scrap of intelligence before the bombs fell. They called themselves 30 Commando, though Fleming preferred his codename, 30 Assault Unit, 30 ADZU. They learned to break locks blindfolded, to move through cities without leaving a trace, to vanish as smoke before dawn. Training was brutal. You will not fight for glory, their instructor told them. You will fight for the silence that follows. One of their recruits was a wiry Scot named Johnny Ramensky, a former bank robber turned soldier. The army had pulled him from prison for one reason. He could open any safe in Europe without explosives. Every bolt has a rhythm, he said, tapping his ear. You just have to listen. Another was Lieutenant Patrick Dalzell-Job, a linguist and mountaineer who could speak German, French, and Norwegian. He'd once sailed through the Arctic under gunfire, rescuing civilians in a storm. Now he'd be sailing into something darker, the underbelly of Hitler's empire. By 1943, the unit's reputation had spread through the secret corridors of British intelligence. They were ghosts with guns, appearing, vanishing, leaving behind only emptied filing cabinets and confused German officers who had no idea what had been taken. They struck radar stations in Sicily, communications hubs in Corsica, and naval archives in Toulon. Every raid fed the growing Allied machine, helping decrypt messages, identify U-boats, track V-2 launches. But the biggest prize was still out of reach, Berlin itself, and the heart of Nazi research buried within it. In the spring of 1944, Fleming received a coded memo stamped Most Secret. It came from MI6 Section 8, Weapons and Scientific Intelligence. The Germans, it said, were hiding blueprints for weapons beyond imagination. Jet-powered fighters, long-range missiles, guided torpedoes, even experimental nuclear research. Most were believed destroyed in Allied bombings, but MI6 had intercepted chatter. The files had been moved to underground vaults under the authority of the Reich Ministry for Armaments and War Production, personally overseen by Albert Speer. Fleming called it the Black Vault. And he wanted it. He summoned 30 AU to a briefing room deep beneath Whitehall. Cigarette smoke and lamplight filled the chamber. The men leaned over a map of Germany, cities marked with pins: Peenemünde, Göttingen, Dresden. Berlin. Fleming tapped the capital. "Gentlemen," he said, "when the Reich collapses, these files must not fall into Russian hands. You will go in first, ahead of the armies, and take them." A murmur rippled through the room. The Russians were allies, but everyone knew the truth. The post-war world would belong to whoever stole Hitler's science. Fleming paused. "This mission doesn't officially exist. If you're caught, you don't exist either." He smiled. The thin, dangerous smile of a man who had already written the ending in his mind. "You are not here to kill men. You are here to kill their future." The mission's cover name, Operation Eclipse. Their objective: infiltrate Berlin ahead of the advancing Allies, locate the vaults of the Technische Hochschule Charlottenburg, an elite engineering school commandeered by the Nazi government, and seize every classified document connected to the Ministry of Armaments, including experimental blueprints rumored to be codenamed Project Morgenrot, Project Red Dawn. Nobody knew what Red Dawn was, only that Hitler himself had demanded it remain hidden until the next century. On April 28, 1945, 2 jeeps carrying men in American uniforms crossed into the outskirts of Berlin under the pretense of supply recovery. Their papers identified them as members of the U.S. 83rd Recon Battalion. In truth, they were 30 commando, dressed in borrowed insignia, armed with Sten guns, bolt cutters, and silence. They drove past burning convoys and shattered tram lines. All around, the city screamed, artillery shaking the ground, buildings collapsing in waves of dust. They parked beside a collapsed bridge and proceeded on foot. Lieutenant Dalzell led the way, compass in hand, map smeared with rain. "Vaults under the old university. 2 blocks north," he whispered. Ramensky glanced at him, a grin flashing beneath soot. 2 blocks in that?" he said, nodding toward a street engulfed in flames. "Better start running." They sprinted through the smoke, hugging walls, dodging falling bricks. A German Tiger tank rumbled somewhere distant, its cannon echoing like thunder. The commando team ducked into the remains of a library, shelves reduced to ash. Inside, beneath the scent of wet paper and cordite, they found a stairwell descending into darkness. "There," Dalzell said. "That's our way in." They switched off their lamps and moved by touch. The walls were slick, the air stale. At the bottom, a blast door thick as a vault. German words painted across, "Nur für Reichsleitung." For Reich leadership only. Ramensky knelt, pressed his ear to the steel. "She's got a delicate lock. Don't rush her," he muttered. He spun the dial, 1 click, 2, 3, then a snap. The wheel turned freely. The door opened with a low metallic sigh. The beam of a flashlight cut through darkness. Inside lay row after row of filing cabinets, bound in red wax seals and stamped with the Reich's eagle crest. Piles of rolled schematics, folders labeled Project Feuerball, Raketenmotor Type X-15 Schattenbombe. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it, a folder marked Morgenrot. They opened it. Inside were blueprints, not for a single weapon, but for an entire generation of machines. Vertical launch rockets twice the size of the V-2, jet aircraft with forward-swept wings. A submarine powered not by diesel, but by atomic reaction. Even in the flicker of their flashlights, the drawings looked like something from another age. Engines that could reach the edge of space. Dalzell whispered, "Christ almighty." What were they building? No one answered. Ramensky just whistled low, eyes wide. "Now I see why the boss sent us." Above them, explosions shook the ceiling. Dust fell from the rafters. The Russians were closing in. They had maybe 30 minutes before the whole district turned to rubble. The commandos grabbed what they could, stuffing blueprints into waterproof tubes, cameras snapping photos, pockets bulging with film reels. As they prepared to leave, they heard footsteps, German officers descending the stairwell, voices shouting, "Orders to destroy the room." Dalzell barked, "Move!" Ramensky, "Set your timers." Plastic explosives went on to the remaining vaults. They fled through the opposite corridor as the German demolition squad entered. Then thunder. The explosion tore through the lower levels. Flames erupted through the stairwell. The shockwave threw dust and fire into the corridors. When it cleared, the vaults were gone. But the commandos and the stolen blueprints were already disappearing into Berlin's chaos. Hours later, In a safe house outside Charlottenburg, Fleming received a telegram. It read only, "The sun has risen." He understood immediately. The Morgenrot files were in Allied hands, and what those papers contained would stun the world's highest officers into silence. The telegram reached London in the grey stillness before dawn. The rain had not stopped since the fall of Berlin. It streaked down the windows of the Admiralty, blurring the lights of Westminster into watery smears. In a small office beneath Whitehall, Ian Fleming stood by the window, the telegram in his hand, his reflection pale against the glass. The sun has risen. The message had no cipher, no unit designation, no signature, just the phrase they had agreed upon before the mission. To anyone else, meaningless. To Fleming, it meant the unthinkable had been done. 30 Assault Unit had breached the heart of the Reich, stolen the contents of Hitler's most guarded vault, and escaped alive. He crushed out his cigarette and exhaled. Somewhere beyond the channel, the men were already on the move, carrying in their packs the blueprints that could reshape the modern world. They didn't take the direct route. Berlin was still a death trap, Russian patrols sweeping every street, civilians turned executioners, and snipers in church towers firing at shadows. The commandos moved like ghosts, blending with the chaos of surrendering troops and refugees, following back alleys and burned tram lines toward the west. Dalzell Job led from the front, compass steady despite the gunfire. His small convoy, 2 jeeps and a captured Opel Blitz truck, carried tubes of blueprints sealed in wax, cameras wrapped in oilcloth, and 3 exhausted men who hadn't slept in 48 hours. The radio crackled intermittently with Soviet orders, in Russian and German echoing across the airwaves. Ramensky listened to one transmission, smiling faintly. "They're looking for us," he muttered. "Let them look," Dalzell Job replied, his eyes on the road. By dawn, they reached a bombed-out checkpoint on the outskirts of Potsdam. A Soviet T-34 sat smoldering on its treads, its turret blown open. The air was thick with oil and smoke. Dead soldiers lay half buried in mud. They stopped briefly to refuel from abandoned drums. Ramensky moved with the calm efficiency of a man robbing a bank. "You ever think about what's in those papers?" one of the younger men asked. "I try not to," Ramensky said. "Makes you nervous to know the devil's homework's in your pocket." As they rolled toward the Elbe River, the sky began to burn. Tracer fire and the dull roar of Soviet bombers overhead. They drove in blackout, headlights dimmed, crossing fields to avoid the main road. Every few miles they passed convoys of German refugees, farmers pushing carts, women dragging children, horses stumbling in the mud. Nobody looked at them twice. Everyone was running from someone. At dawn, they reached the bridge at Barbie, one of the few still standing. On the far bank, American troops, engineers of the 83rd Infantry Division, watched them approach through binoculars. Dalzell Job raised his hands, showing their papers which bore American insignia and the forged seal of Schaff. The sergeant in charge glanced at the documents, then at their faces, mud-streaked, hollow-eyed. "Uniforms without clear markings, you boys from recon." "That's right," Dalzell Job said, voice steady. "You came from Berlin?" the sergeant asked, disbelief in his tone. "What's left of it," he replied. The Americans waved them through. As their jeep rolled across the bridge, the wind carried the faint echo of distant artillery, the sound of the city dying behind them. In the ruins of Magdeburg, they rendezvoused with a British signals detachment. From there, the blueprints were packed into sealed crates and loaded onto a transport convoy bound for Brussels under diplomatic priority. The men were told nothing about what would happen next, only that their mission was complete. But for Fleming, it was only beginning. When the crates arrived in London, they were taken not to the War Office, but to a nondescript building on Baker Street, the headquarters of the Scientific Intelligence Division, a branch so secret even its clerks didn't know who they worked for. Inside, a small group of analysts and engineers gathered around the recovered documents. One of them, Dr. Reginald Victor Jones, the same man who had masterminded Britain's radar defenses, flipped through the blueprints with growing disbelief. "This can't be right," he murmured. "Some of these designs, they're 20 years ahead of us." He traced a finger over a schematic labeled Raketenjäger Type X4. It showed a jet interceptor armed with guided missiles, drawings so advanced they resembled the first blueprints of the Cold War. Another folder contained diagrams of submersible aircraft carriers, designed to launch V-2 rockets from beneath the sea. One even showed a crude sketch of what appeared to be a nuclear propulsion chamber. Primitive, but real. Fleming stood quietly at the back of the room, watching the scientists' faces change from curiosity to unease. "We always thought they were desperate," Jones whispered, "but they were planning the next century." For the next 3 days, the Baker Street offices operated without rest. The documents were catalogued, photographed, and flown under military escort to Bletchley Park, then onward to Washington, D.C. under Operation Paperclip. But there was something else, something buried within the Morgenrot files that didn't make sense. Among the technical schematics and production notes was a series of cryptic memos, all signed with the same initials, EK. The notes referenced experimental test sites, unknown materials, and a facility somewhere in the Harz Mountains referred to only as Der Schwarze Kasten, the black box. The name struck a chill even in the analysts. No location, no coordinates, just one phrase repeated over and over. If the Red Army reaches the Kasten first, all is lost. Fleming understood immediately. The mission wasn't over. The blueprints were only half the puzzle. The machines they described had been built somewhere, and that place still existed. He ordered 30 Commando to regroup in Hanover. The war was officially over. The Germans had surrendered on May 8th, but in the shadows of victory, the race for the future had begun. The Soviets were already moving west, sweeping through Thuringia, seizing scientists and equipment before the Allies could react. Stalin had ordered his own special teams, trophy brigades, to capture everything related to German technology. The Americans were doing the same under Operation Alsos, targeting rocket engineers and nuclear physicists. The line between ally and rival was vanishing fast. Fleming's orders were simple: find the black box before anyone else did. By mid-May, the men were on the move again, this time disguised as engineers from the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Corps. Their cover story: inspection of captured German facilities. Their destination: the Harz Mountains, a region riddled with mines, tunnels, and hidden factories. The road wound through dense pine forests and ghost towns, every village half destroyed, every field strewn with burned machinery. Locals stared in silence as the jeeps passed. Some still wore remnants of their uniforms, Wehrmacht coats turned inside out. They reached a small town called Blankenberg, where a local farmer directed them toward a sealed mine entrance north of the ridge. "The soldiers went there," he said. "They never came back." Dalzell studied the map. The coordinates matched one of the coded references in the Morgenrot notes. That night, under moonlight, they approached the mine. The entrance had been collapsed, intentionally, but a narrow ventilation shaft remained open. Ramensky peered down with a flashlight. "Looks like a way in," he said. "Then we're going down," Dalzell replied. They descended one by one, the shaft cold and slick with condensation. At the bottom, they found a reinforced tunnel leading into darkness. The air smelled faintly of oil and ozone. They followed the tunnel for nearly 200 meters before reaching a steel bulkhead. Across it, in German script, were the words Schutzhaftbereich, Zutritt verboten, protective custody zone, entry forbidden. Dalzell turned to his men. "We found it." Ramensky cracked the lock in less than a minute. The door opened with a hiss. What they saw beyond it defied belief. The cavern stretched wider than any mine they'd seen, an underground hangar, lit by a handful of flickering lamps still running on backup generators. Along the wall stood the remnants of half-finished machines, jet fuselages, rocket casings, rows of spherical tanks connected by copper tubing. In the center of the chamber lay a concrete pit filled with water, and within it, a cylindrical structure that looked like a reactor. Fleming's notes had warned them. Some experiments had continued even after Berlin fell. They approached cautiously. On a nearby desk lay notebooks filled with calculations, uranium isotope ratios, neutron diagrams, power yields. At the top of each page, the initials EK. One of the commandos picked up a photo pinned to the wall. It showed a man in a white coat standing beside the same device, smiling faintly at the camera. On the back of the photo, a name: Dr. Erich Kleiber. Dalzell frowned. "He's not in any of the files." "He is now," Ramensky replied, slipping the photo into his pocket. Suddenly, they heard footsteps and faint echoing down the tunnel. Someone else was down there. The commandos doused their lights and crouched behind a row of machinery. Voices, German, 2 or 3 men. They carried lanterns and pistols. One of them spoke in a trembling voice. Alles zerstören. Alles. Destroy everything. They watched as the men began pouring fuel across the floor, setting fire to the remaining papers. Dalzell gave the signal. A single suppressed shot cracked through the darkness. The lantern shattered, plunging the cavern into chaos. The remaining men panicked, one firing blindly, another fleeing into the tunnel. When the echoes faded, the fires were spreading. They had minutes at best. Ramensky dashed forward, grabbing as many notebooks as he could before the flames reached the reactor pit. Dalzell ordered the others out. The tunnel roared with heat and smoke as they climbed back through the shaft, coughing, eyes stinging. When they emerged into the cold mountain air, the ground shook. The entire hillside erupted in a muffled explosion as the underground chamber collapsed. They had destroyed the black box, but not before, stealing its last surviving fragments. By the time they reached Hanover, Allied command had already heard rumors. The Americans were furious. The Soviets livid. Both had dispatched their own units to the Harz region, but found only rubble and silence. The notebooks reached London under armed escort. They were classified immediately, eyes only, Prime Minister and Chiefs of Staff. Inside were notes describing an experiment codenamed Morgenrot 2, an attempt to create a self-sustaining reaction using modified uranium salts. It was crude, incomplete, but the implications were clear. The Germans had been closer to building a nuclear reactor than anyone had dared imagine. Weeks later, Fleming stood again in his Whitehall office. The war was over. Europe lay in ashes. But in the secret halls of intelligence, a new kind of war was already beginning. One fought not for land, but for knowledge. He looked over the recovered documents spread across his desk. The blueprints, the notes, the photographs of the black box. He thought of his men, of Dalzell still out there, somewhere between history and myth, of Ramensky, back in a cell for crimes the government preferred not to acknowledge. And he thought of the silence that followed their discovery, the silence in every briefing room when the scientists realized what had almost happened. The future had nearly belonged to the Reich, but because of 30 nameless men, it now belonged to the world. Fleming lit a final cigarette and wrote one line in his notebook before locking it away. The war was not won by soldiers alone. It was won by thieves of the future. The smoke of the old world still hung in the air. Cities lay quiet beneath their own ashes, and across Germany, the echoes of artillery were giving way to the drone of engines, trucks, half-tracks, and trains loaded not with troops, but with scientists. The war for Europe was over. The war for knowledge had begun. In May 1945, as Allied soldiers returned home, a new kind of army swept through Germany's ruins, one without uniforms, without banners, armed not with rifles but with lists of names, laboratories, coordinates, names whispered through captured correspondence or decoded intercepts. Von Braun, Heisenberg, Diebner, Debus, Peenemünde, Mittelwerk, Harz. Every one of them was a potential key to the future. Among those lists, one stood out, coded in Fleming's hand, sealed with the crest of naval intelligence. It contained the names of 25 scientists linked to Morgenrot 2, the project his commandos had uncovered in the Black Vault. The files were incomplete, half-burned, some written in cipher. But the implication was enough to terrify the War Office. If even one of those men reached Soviet hands, the balance of the next century could tip overnight. In a damp briefing room in Hanover, Fleming unrolled a new map of Germany. His eyes traced the red demarcation lines that cut the country in half, the Soviet zone to the east, the British and American zones to the west. He drew small X's across villages, towns, and mountain passes. They'll go underground, he said quietly. Scientists don't surrender, they disappear. Across the table, Commander Dalzell nodded. His face was gaunt, unshaven. The mission at the Black Vault had taken everything out of him. But when Fleming spoke of another operation, he didn't hesitate. You'll take the same team, Fleming said. Officially, this doesn't exist. If you're captured, you're scavengers, thieves, understand? Dalzell allowed himself a small smile. We've been called worse. Their orders were simple. Locate the remaining Morgenrot scientists before the Soviets did. The problem, the Soviets were already hunting them too. The first name on the list was Dr. Helmut Diebner, a physicist who had directed experiments with uranium at Gotto. Intelligence reported he was hiding somewhere near Hamburg, under an assumed name. The second was Erich Kleiber, the man whose initials had appeared on the blueprints, the ghost behind Morgenrot. No one knew if he was alive. But if he was, he'd be the prize every nation wanted. They set out in a convoy disguised as a relief unit from the British Control Commission. Their vehicles carried crates labeled medical supplies. Inside were rifles, forged papers, and portable radio sets. The countryside was chaos. Millions of displaced people wandering roads that no longer led anywhere. Children trading cigarettes for bread. German soldiers burning their uniforms. In a small village outside Bremen, they found the first clue. An old woman told them of a man who had arrived weeks earlier. Polite, quiet, carrying a violin case and a forged identification card. He called himself Herr Clausen, but when he played in the evenings, he never touched the strings. Inside the violin case, they found notebooks. He left 2 days ago, the woman said. Russians came looking for him. The trail led east toward Lübeck and the Soviet frontier. The team split up. Dalzell-Job and Ramensky took a jeep north following the Elbe. At night, they slept in barns or under the trucks listening to distant gunfire. The front may have been silent, but the war had not yet ended in the minds of men. One evening, near a destroyed bridge, they came upon a group of Soviet soldiers interrogating a German civilian. The man was on his knees begging, his face bloodied. Dalzell-Job crouched in the trees, binoculars steady. They're asking about the scientists, Ramensky whispered. They waited until the Russians moved on, then slipped down to the riverbank. The man was barely alive. He looked up as they approached, eyes clouded with terror. They took him, he rasped, the one with the violin. He said his name was Kleiber. He died before saying more. By morning, they were already moving. The chase became a blur. Abandoned roads, villages in smoke, checkpoints where soldiers of 3 different armies all claimed authority. The Soviets had taken Lübeck. The border was closing. Dalzell-Job sent one coded transmission back to Fleming. Target likely east of line, moving through Mecklenburg. If captured, probable transfer to Soviet Scientific Division. Fleming read the message in silence. He knew what that meant. The Soviets would never release him. Days later, in an abandoned farmhouse near Wismar, Ramensky cracked open a German courier bag taken from a retreating Soviet truck. Inside were several photographs stamped NKVD. One showed a man under guard, face bruised, coat torn. On the back, written in Cyrillic, Dr. Erich Kleiber, valuable asset. Transfer to Moscow pending. Dalzell-Job stared at the photo. We're not letting them take him. It was insane. The war was over. The Soviets were technically allies, and yet here they were, planning to ambush a convoy of Red Army soldiers in the middle of occupied Germany. But orders no longer mattered. History did. At dawn on June 4, 1945, they found the convoy. 3 trucks and an armored car moving south on a forest road near Schwerin. Dalzell-Job set up his men in the trees, 1 Bren gun, 3 rifles, and Ramensky with his satchel of explosives. When the lead truck hit the curve, Ramensky tossed a grenade beneath the wheels. The explosion tore through the still morning air. The convoy screeched to a halt, soldiers scrambling for cover. Dalzell-Job's men opened fire, quick, controlled bursts. 2 Russians fell. The rest surrendered almost instantly, dazed and shocked. Inside the second truck, they found him. Dr. Kleiber, hands bound, staring in disbelief. "You're British?" he asked in perfect English. "For now," Dalzell-Job said. "Get in the jeep." They drove for hours, changing roads, evading checkpoints, until they reached the British zone. Behind them, the forest smoldered, the last echo of the war fading into the wind. Kleiber said little at first. He was pale, exhausted, his spectacles cracked. But when they reached a safe house near Hanover, he finally spoke. "You have my work," he said. "The Morgenrot files." "What was it?" Dalzell-Job asked. "Not a weapon. A beginning." He explained that the black box had been only one phase of a larger vision, a plan to use atomic energy not just for destruction, but for propulsion, communication, even medicine. He had opposed the militarization of his research, which was why the SS had hidden him away. They wanted to build a sun in a bottle, he said softly, but they never asked if it should burn. 2 days later, Fleming arrived by air from London. He met Kleiber in a dim room lined with blackout curtains. "You built the black box?" "I designed it," Kleiber replied, "but I tried to destroy it before they could finish." Fleming leaned forward. "What did you mean by the sun has risen?" Kleiber smiled faintly. "Because I saw it, Commander." In the chamber, for an instant, the reaction sustained itself. For less than a second, we held the power of a star. Then it failed. But it was enough to prove it could be done. The room fell silent. Fleming understood the implications. Britain had just stepped into a new age, one defined not by soldiers, but by scientists who could create suns underground. He closed the notebook slowly. "You'll come with us," he said, "but not as a prisoner." Kleiber nodded. No one should be a prisoner of what they create. In the weeks that followed, 30 Commando disbanded quietly. Their mission no longer had a name, their records sealed, their medals non-existent. Some returned to civilian life. Others were absorbed into the newly forming MI6 and SOE successors. Fleming was already writing again. This time, not memos, but fiction. He began sketching notes for a story about a secret agent who moved through the shadows of war, stealing secrets from men who thought they ruled the world. It was not difficult to see where the inspiration came from. As for Kleiber, he vanished. Officially, he was listed among the scientists, relocated to the British Isles for post-war research. Unofficially, no one ever saw him again. Some said he was taken to Canada under a new name. Others claimed he defected to the Americans. But in the archives of naval intelligence, one file remained stamped with his name, sealed, untitled, marked only with a single line in Fleming's handwriting. He lit the fuse on the future. The world had moved on. The Cold War was dawning. And in the laboratories of Washington, Moscow, and London, men were already sketching new machines, missiles, reactors, submarines, all built from the ashes of the Black Vault. But for the veterans of 30 Commando, the silence remained. Theirs was a war no one would ever acknowledge, fought not for medals or borders, but for the soul of the century that followed. London, summer 1945. The war had ended, but the city hadn't exhaled yet. The Thames moved like black oil beneath bridges still pockmarked by shrapnel. Floodlights were gone, but the streets remained dim, as if the city feared what light might reveal. Inside a low building on Baker Street, men still reported for duty, though no one called it that anymore. Naval Intelligence had a new name, Section 30B. On paper, it no longer existed. In truth, it had never stopped. Ian Fleming sat in his office surrounded by maps, memos, and half-burned photographs. He hadn't slept more than a few hours a night since Hanover. The war had left him rich in information and poor in peace. The Black Vault, the Morgenrot files, Kleiber's confession, none of it had faded. Instead, it had deepened into a new kind of unease. He once told a colleague, "We won the war by learning what the enemy knew." The question now is, what do we do with it? A thin envelope lay on his desk, stamped Eyes Only, CIG, Washington, D.C. The newly formed Central Intelligence Group, the precursor to the CIA, was asking for cooperation. They wanted every scrap of technical intelligence on the Reich's nuclear experiments, rocket propulsion, and advanced naval warfare. All of it. Fleming knew why. The Americans were already building something, a secret project in the desert of New Mexico. The word Manhattan kept appearing in intercepted telegrams. What they were constructing there was beyond anything Germany had attempted. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single-page memo. Subject, Joint Post-War Retrieval Protocol, and a codename. Operation Silence. Objective, neutralization or assimilation of all scientific personnel deemed strategically significant. Method, discretionary. Below that word, discretionary, was a name written in blue ink, Commander Ian Fleming, Royal Naval Intelligence. He stared at it for a long time before lighting another cigarette. The idea of Operation Silence was simple. Silence not through death, but through erasure. Every scientist, engineer, or technician who had worked on advanced projects for the Reich would either be captured, absorbed, or made to disappear. The Americans called it containment. The British called it deniability. and it fell to Fleming's men, or what remained of them, to carry it out. Dalziel returned reluctantly. He had wanted to disappear himself, to vanish into the north with a fishing boat and forget the faces of the men he'd killed, but Fleming's message reached him through an intermediary. The mission isn't over. We need you for one last retrieval. When he arrived in London, he found the office half empty, the walls stripped of insignia. Ramensky was there too, fresh out of prison again, smiling like he'd just escaped his own conscience. Fleming briefed them both in private. "Kleiber's gone underground," he said. "Our scientists?" Dalziel asked. "Ours, theirs, everyone's. The Americans have half of Peenemünde. The Soviets have the other half. We have fragments, and one missing mind." He laid a single photograph on the desk. A man boarding a freighter in Antwerp, the outline of guards at his back. "This was taken 3 days ago. Ship bound for Argentina. We believe it's carrying German scientists, and documents from Morgenrot to II. If they reach Buenos Aires, they'll vanish into South America forever." Fleming tapped the photo. That can't happen. The ship was called the SS Santa Lucia, an unmarked freighter registered to a neutral shipping company. But intelligence traced its ownership back to a network of former SS officers operating under the Odessa program, an underground route smuggling Nazis out of Europe under forged identities. The 30 Commando team reassembled, only 5 men now. Their uniforms were gone, replaced with civilian coats and forged merchant papers. They carried no rank, no flags, and no future if caught. "We're not soldiers anymore," Dalziel told them quietly before departure. "We're the ghosts cleaning up after the war." They boarded a small coastal vessel at Plymouth and followed the Santa Lucia south through the Bay of Biscay, staying just beyond radar range. At sea, the nights were endless. Dark horizons broken only by lightning and the faint red glow of a ship's stern light. Ramensky worked by lamplight, adjusting the detonators that would cripple the freighter if things went wrong. "You ever think about what's on that ship?" he asked. "Every night," Dalziel replied. And I hope it's not what I think it is." 3 days later, under moonless skies, they caught the Santa Lucia near the Azores. Through binoculars, they could see the deck, crates lashed down, guards smoking at the bow. Below in the cargo hold lay the stolen legacy of the Third Reich. They came alongside under cover of darkness. Ramensky climbed first, blade between his teeth, cutting the rope silently. Within minutes, the commandos were aboard. A brief scuffle, 2 guards down, 1 wounded. The ship's captain froze when Dalziel pressed a pistol to his chest. "Where are the scientists?" "Below deck," the captain stammered. "But there's one man in charge. He says he's expected in Argentina." They forced the hatch open. The air below reeked of fuel and mildew. At the far end of the hold, behind stacks of crates, stood a man in a long coat. His hands were bound, his eyes cold but defiant. "Dr. Kleiber," Dalziel said softly. The reunion was wordless. Kleiber looked thinner, older, but his composure hadn't cracked. "You think you can stop it," he said calmly. "But knowledge doesn't vanish. You can burn papers, kill men, but you can't unlearn an idea." Dalziel raised his pistol. "We're not here to kill you." "Then you're wasting your time." Before anyone could answer, a gunshot echoed. One of the guards had fired from the shadows. The bullet tore through Kleiber's shoulder, spinning him to the floor. Dalziel shot the guard instantly. The deck erupted in chaos and shouting, smoke, the pounding of boots. Fleming's men dragged Kleiber topside, blood soaking his coat. Ramensky detonated a charge at the stern, crippling the ship's engines. Flames licked up the mast as they hauled Kleiber into their own vessel. The Santa Lucia burned against the black water. Its cargo, the stolen blueprints, the crates of documents, the legacy of Morgenrot, sinking into the Atlantic. Kleiber survived the wound, but not the silence that followed. He was taken to a hospital in Gibraltar under a false name. Fleming visited him once, standing by his bedside as the doctor stepped away. "You should have let me go," Kleiber whispered. "You would have built another black box," Fleming said. "You already have," Kleiber replied. "You just don't know it yet." He died 2 days later. His body was buried at sea. No record, no headstone. Officially, he never existed. Weeks later, Fleming filed his final report. Operation Silence had succeeded. The documents were destroyed. The scientists accounted for. The secrets contained. But in his private notes, he wrote a different line. "We silenced the enemy, and in doing so, silenced the truth. Because deep down, Fleming understood what Kleiber meant. The knowledge they had stolen would not die with its creators. It would seed the next era, the arms race, the nuclear divide, the covert world he was now helping to build. And as he left the Admiralty for the last time, walking through corridors lined with files that would never see daylight, he already knew how the next war would be fought, not with tanks nor armies, but with secrets. That autumn, on a cold morning in Kent, Fleming began to write again. He sat alone with a typewriter and a bottle of gin, the sea visible through the window. His fingers hesitated above the keys, then began to move. "The world is not enough," he wrote, "and those who live in its shadows must learn to kill for silence." The man who had once stolen Hitler's blueprints was now sketching the blueprint for something else, a character who lived between truth and fiction, a mirror of every secret Fleming had buried. His name would be Bond. The sea was calm that morning, too calm for October. The war had been over for months, yet England still felt like a country half asleep, dreaming uneasy dreams it could not wake from. Somewhere beyond Dover's cliffs, the horizon bled into the sky, a gray line between what had been and what was coming. Ian Fleming stood alone on the shore. He had not worn a uniform since the Admiralty dismissed his section into secrecy. The gold insignia once pinned to his lapel now lay forgotten in a drawer, replaced by an ink-stained pen and a cigarette that burned slower than the memories he carried. The gulls screamed above him, their wings cutting through the silence. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he heard it all again. The gunfire over Schwerin, the echo of boots in the black vault, the quiet hum of a ship burning on black water. War was supposed to end with peace, but Fleming knew better. It ended with paperwork, the kind stamped top secret and locked away in the dark. Behind him, a car door slammed. Commander Patrick Dalzell approached, older now, his face carved by exhaustion and salt air. He carried no weapon, only a folder, thin, unmarked, sealed in red wax. "It's done," Dalzell said. "All of it?" "Every copy, every name, every photograph. The Morgenrot archives have been destroyed." Fleming didn't turn. He watched the sea instead. "Destroyed," he repeated. "Or hidden." Dalzell hesitated. "You can't destroy what lives in men's minds." The two stood there for a long time, the wind cold against their coats. Somewhere behind them, England was rebuilding. Children playing in streets cleared of rubble, factories lighting up again, laughter returning to pubs. But beneath that new peace, something darker stirred. The war had given birth to a new kind of soldier, one without an army, one who fought in silence. Weeks later, Fleming was summoned to Whitehall. The corridors were busier now, full of new faces in pressed suits, men who had never seen a battlefield but now commanded nations with signatures and telegrams. He was led into a small office overlooking Horse Guards parade. Inside sat Major General Sir Stuart Menzies, the head of MI6, known simply as C. "You've done remarkable work, Commander," Menzies said, tapping a file. "But times are changing. There's a new front forming, and we intend to be ready for it." "A new front?" Fleming asked. "The Soviets are consolidating the scientists they captured," Menzies said. "Half of Peenemünde now operates under Moscow's orders. We believe they're developing a jet engine beyond anything the Luftwaffe built." He slid a document across the table. Fleming read the heading: Operation Unthinkable, Strategic Scenarios for a Soviet Conflict. Fleming looked up sharply. "You can't be serious." "Entirely," Menzies replied. "Churchill ordered it himself before stepping down. If Stalin pushes west, we'll need every secret we stole, and every man who knows how to steal them again." There it was. The unspoken truth. The war had ended, but the game had only changed its name. In the weeks that followed, Fleming worked quietly, drafting memoranda that would lay the foundation for Britain's new intelligence structure, a peacetime spy apparatus with wartime instincts. Section 30B became a whisper that fed into the creation of the Information Research Department, then into MI6's technical division. Many of its former operatives vanished, some recruited by the Americans for Operation Paperclip, others buried in new postings across Europe under aliases, and through it all, the stolen fragments of Morgenrot II were divided, copied, and rewritten into classified studies: atomic propulsion, magnetic containment, and radiation medicine. The documents bore no signatures now. The names of Kleiber, Diebner, and the others were erased. But their ideas, their ghosts, lived on in laboratories in Aldermaston, Los Alamos, and Moscow. The race for the future had begun. In a basement office beneath the Admiralty, Fleming met again with Menzies one last time. The walls were lined with photographs from the war, black and white faces fading into the past. "You understand what's coming, don't you?" Menzies asked. "A war without guns," Fleming replied. "Exactly. The enemy won't be in uniform. He'll be sitting across from you at dinner smiling." Meanies handed him a small folder labeled Project Double Edge. Inside were photographs of two men, one British, one Soviet. Both had been part of the wartime intelligence exchange in Switzerland. One was now suspected of defecting, espionage, Menzies said. "It's the new battlefield, and we'll need men who understand the shadows." Fleming closed the folder. He'd spent years chasing secrets through smoke and blood. Now he would be building the next generation to live there. "We're creating ghosts," he said. "No," Menzies replied. "We're making sure the ghosts work for us." By 1946, the war that couldn't be spoken of had already begun. In the streets of Berlin, Western agents traded bribes for blueprints. In the snows of Poland, Soviet patrols hunted defectors. In Washington, scientists who had once worked for Hitler now sat behind desks at the Pentagon. And somewhere, beneath London's fog, Fleming wrote reports that no one would ever read. Theories on psychological warfare, deception, and the value of fiction in intelligence. Because Fleming had discovered something vital. Sometimes a story could carry a secret better than a file ever could. He once wrote in a private memo, "The world will always need heroes, but the ones who matter most will never be known by name." In 1947, the Cold War's first tremors rippled through Europe. Churchill, now out of office, delivered his speech in Fulton, Missouri. "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." Fleming heard it on the radio in his London flat. The words made him smile bitterly. The curtain had descended long before the speech, and he had helped draw it. Dalzell Jubb sent a letter that same year, postmarked from Norway, written in his neat, stoic hand. "The sea is calm again. Ian, I think of the old days. I still see their faces. We did our duty, but I wonder if the future we saved is one worth saving." Fleming folded the letter carefully and locked it away with his war notebooks. He never replied. Years passed. The world forgot 30 Commando. Fleming moved on. To journalism, to novels, to Jamaica and the blue Caribbean he'd once dreamed of while listening to the London rain. Yet the past never left him. When he sat down to write his first story, about a secret agent who lived on the edge of legality, a man who killed not for country, but for order, he wasn't writing fiction. He was remembering the men who stole Hitler's blueprints, who fought not for glory but for silence. Remembering the moment they stared into the black vault and saw humanity's reflection in its own invention. He called his character James Bond, a man of discipline, secrecy, and the quiet burden of knowing too much. In every explosion, every seduction, every shadowed villain of the Bond novels, there was a trace of the world Fleming had lived, a world built on Operation Silence, where truth itself became the most dangerous weapon. But the real story, the one no book would ever tell, remained locked in the Admiralty archives. In 1951, a junior clerk cataloging declassified files stumbled upon an unmarked folder. 30 photographs, brittle and faded, each stamped Morgenrot 2. The faces were barely visible through the dust. One showed a burning ship in the Atlantic. Another, a group of men standing before a steel vault deep underground. Across the last image, scrawled in pencil, were 3 words: "The sun has risen." The clerk asked his supervisor about it. The man frowned, took the folder, and returned an hour later. "You must be mistaken," he said. "No such operation ever existed." The folder was never seen again. Fleming died in 1964, the year before the world first saw the mushroom clouds over the Nevada desert in color television broadcasts. He was buried quietly in Sevenhampton, far from the sea he loved. In his study, among the typewritten pages of his novels, archivists found one small notebook, leather-bound, its cover worn smooth by years of use. Inside were only 2 sentences. "We thought we were ending a war. We were beginning a new one." In the decades that followed, the truth about 30 Commandos surfaced in fragments. Declassified memos, scattered testimonies, whispers from aging veterans who remembered the men who stole from Hitler himself. But the full story of the Black Vault, of Kleiber, of the reactor that flickered like a captured sun remained buried, deep in the labyrinth of national secrets, and yet, sometimes history leaves an echo, faint but persistent. In 1991, during the reunification of Germany, excavation teams uncovered the remains of an underground complex in the Harz Mountains. Among the rubble was a twisted metal cylinder and a rusted sign that read, Schutzhaftbereich, Zutritt verboten. Tests showed traces of uranium and graphite embedded in the concrete. When reporters asked British authorities for comment, the response was brief. No record exists of any Allied operation in that region. But in a vault beneath London, a single file remained sealed, yellowed paper, brittle photographs, and at the top, in Ian Fleming's handwriting, Project Morgenrot, the sun that never set. And so the story ends not with victory or defeat, but with silence, the kind that lingers in classified rooms in old reels of film never developed, in the quiet guilt of men who stole the future to protect the present. The world they built still spins, balanced on the edge of the discoveries they buried. And somewhere beneath all the fiction and the myth, the truth glows faintly, like a hidden sunrise that refuses to die.